Emily Dawson loved the streets more than anyone could imagine. To her, they were alive. The endless stream of people, the mix of noises, laughter, footsteps, distant car horns, all of it felt like a symphony. It wasn't chaos to Emily, it was rhythm. And within that rhythm, she found her own beat, her own way to express what words never could. The sidewalk was her stage, though it wasn't grand or polished. There were no spotlights or velvet curtains. Instead, there were cracks in the pavement and chewing gum stuck to the ground. But Emily didn't care. The streets gave her something no theater ever could, a raw, unpredictable energy that made every performance feel new and alive. Every morning, she would set up her small corner near the coffee shop on Jefferson Street. It wasn't a prime spot, but it was hers. She'd place her portable speaker carefully on the ground, lay out a small hat for tips, and press play. Then, as the music began to flow, so did she. Her movements were fluid, almost otherworldly. Her arms painted invisible lines in the air, her feet tapped and turned with precision, and her whole body seemed to tell a story, one that only she knew. But despite her skill, most people didn't notice. To them, she was just another street performer. Some hurried past her without so much as a glance, their minds preoccupied with meetings, errands, and the endless rush of daily life. Others paused for a second, their curiosity piqued, only to shrug and move on. A few tossed coins into her hat, though never enough to make a difference. Emily didn't let it bother her. She wasn't out there for applause or money. She danced because she loved it. The music wasn't just sound to her, it was a feeling, a force that coursed through her veins. And when she danced, she felt free. But freedom didn't pay the bills. Emily's life wasn't easy. She lived in a tiny, run-down apartment just a few blocks away. The walls were thin, and the radiator barely worked in the winter. Her neighbors were loud, and the plumbing groaned like it was on its last legs. But it was all she could afford. She had tried other jobs, waitressing, retail, even a short stint at a call center, but nothing ever stuck. Dancing was the only thing that felt right, even if it didn't pay much. It was her passion, her purpose. Today was like any other day, or at least that's what Emily thought as she stepped onto her makeshift stage. The morning sun cast a warm glow on the city, and a light breeze carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee from the shop nearby. She took a deep breath, feeling the familiar buzz of anticipation in her chest. Dressed in her usual attire, faded leggings, a loose t-shirt, and scuffed sneakers, Emily didn't look like much. Her clothes were practical, chosen for movement rather than style. Her hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup. She didn't need it. Her performance was her statement, her way of showing the world who she was. The music started, a soft, melodic tune that built slowly. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. Then, she began to move. Her first step was small, almost hesitant, like the beginning of a conversation. Then came another, more confident this time. Her arms stretched out, her hands tracing invisible patterns in the air. With each beat, her movements grew bolder, more intricate. She spun, leapt, and turned, her body a blur of motion and grace. A few people stopped to watch, their curiosity piqued. They stood at a distance, hesitant to get too close. Most held their coffee cups or shopping bags, their faces a mix of interest and indifference. "Not bad," someone muttered, tossing a quarter into her hat. Emily didn't hear them. She was in her own world, lost in the rhythm. The crowd's reactions didn't matter to her. Whether they clapped or walked away, she would still dance. But as much as she tried to focus on her movements, a small part of her couldn't ignore the whispers. "Why does she even bother?" a man said to his companion, shaking his head. "No one's paying attention." "Probably just looking for handouts," the other replied with a shrug. Emily's chest tightened, but she didn't let it show. She kept her head high, her gaze steady. She had heard it all before: the dismissive comments, the judgmental looks. To them, she was invisible. But that was fine. She didn't need their validation. Still, it hurt sometimes. Emily finished her routine with a final spin, landing gracefully on the balls of her feet. She held her pose for a moment, her chest rising and falling with each breath. The music faded, and for a second, there was silence. Then came a smattering of applause. A few people clapped politely before dispersing, their attention already shifting to their next destination. Emily smiled softly, bowing her head in thanks. She bent down to pick up her hat, her fingers brushing against the few coins and small bills inside. It wasn't much, maybe enough for lunch if she was lucky. But she didn't let the disappointment show on her face. As she straightened up, she caught sight of her reflection in a nearby window. She looked tired, her eyes carrying the weight of too many sleepless nights and too many dreams deferred. But there was also something else, something fierce and unyielding. Emily wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to dance, another chance to prove herself even if no one was watching. For now, she packed up her things, the sound of her portable speaker clicking off the only farewell she needed. As she walked away, the rhythm of the streets followed her, a constant reminder of why she danced. Because no matter how small the stage or how indifferent the audience, the music was always there. And as long as there was music, Emily would keep moving. Unseen by most, unappreciated by many, but unstoppable all the same. As Emily walked away from her usual spot, the weight of the day already felt heavy on her shoulders. The rhythmic clinking of coins in her hat was far too sparse to lift her spirits. She tucked her portable speaker under her arm and adjusted her scarf against the cool morning air. Jefferson Street was coming alive around her. Delivery trucks unloaded crates of fresh produce for nearby markets, the sharp smell of oranges mingling with the dampness of the city. Shopkeepers propped open their doors, and the distant hum of conversations buzzed through the air. But Emily wasn't part of this world. She was always on the outside, skimming the edges of these routines. She didn't have a shop to open or a desk to sit behind. Her job wasn't considered real work by most people, and sometimes, she wondered if they were right. By now, Emily's day had a predictable rhythm. After her morning performance, she'd walk a few blocks to the library, her unofficial office. It was a quiet, warm place where she could recharge her speaker and plan her next moves. The librarian, Mrs. Green, was one of the few people who spoke to Emily like she mattered. She greeted Emily with a soft smile when she walked in, her silver-rimmed glasses slipping down her nose. "Back again, Emily." "Like clockwork," Emily replied, setting her things down at her usual corner table. Mrs. Green tilted her head, studying her. "You look tired." "Rough day." "Nothing out of the ordinary," Emily said with a shrug, though her voice carried a hint of weariness. "Just the usual. Dance, get ignored, repeat." Mrs. Green frowned but didn't press. She had known Emily long enough to recognize when she didn't want to talk. Instead, she handed her a cup of tea from behind the counter. "On the house," Mrs. Green said warmly. "You need to keep your strength up." Emily took the cup gratefully, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "Thanks," she said softly. "For everything." She sat down and opened her notebook, flipping through pages filled with hastily scribbled ideas and choreography notes. The notebook was her lifeline, a place where her dreams lived in ink. Most of the pages were filled with plans for a performance she hoped to stage someday, a real one, in a theater, with lights and costumes and an audience that didn't just wander by. But that dream felt so far away, like a flicker of light she couldn't quite reach. As Emily worked, her mind began to drift. She couldn't ignore the voices of the passers-by from earlier. Why does she even bother? The words echoed in her head, relentless and cruel. She had thick skin, she'd needed it to survive in this world, but some days, the doubts crept in, gnawing at the edges of her confidence. What if they were right? What if all her effort was pointless? Emily shook her head, as if the motion could dislodge the negativity. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes and reminding herself why she started dancing in the first place. She had been just 7 years old when she first saw a dancer perform. It was during a community festival in her small hometown. The performer had moved like water, smooth and unstoppable, her body flowing effortlessly to the music. Emily had been mesmerized, her young heart pounding with excitement. She remembered tugging on her mother's sleeve, her voice filled with awe. "I want to do that. I want to be like her." Her mother had smiled, though there was a hint of worry in her eyes. "It's a hard life, Emmy," she had said gently. "But if it's what you love, then go for it. Just promise me you'll never give up." That memory was her anchor, the thing she clung to when the world felt like it was closing in. She had promised her mother, and she intended to keep that promise. Later that afternoon, Emily decided to return to Jefferson Street for another performance. The morning crowd might have ignored her, but afternoons brought a different energy. There were more families, more tourists, people who might be willing to stop and watch. She set up her speaker and hat again, brushing off the earlier doubts. The first notes of her chosen song filled the air, and she began to dance. This time, her movements were more powerful, more deliberate. She poured her frustration into each step, each spin, letting the music carry her away. A small crowd began to gather, their faces curious and intrigued. A little girl tugged on her mother's hand, pointing excitedly at Emily. "Look, Mommy. She's so pretty." The woman smiled, pulling out a dollar bill and dropping it into Emily's hat. "You're very talented," she said, her voice warm and genuine. Emily nodded in thanks, her heart lifting slightly. For a moment, she felt seen. But not everyone in the crowd was kind. A group of teenagers lingered at the edge, their laughter loud and mocking. "Is she serious?" one of them said, snickering. "What is this, a free circus show?" Emily kept dancing, refusing to let them get to her. But their voices grew louder, their words sharper. "Hey, dancer girl," another called out. "Why don't you get a real job?" The crowd's mood shifted, discomfort spreading among the onlookers. Some people began to walk away, not wanting to get involved. Emily's movements faltered for a split second, her confidence wavering. But then she remembered her mother's words. Never give up. Her jaw tightened, and she straightened her posture. She danced harder, faster, her body a blur of motion. The music swelled, and with it, so did her determination. The teenagers eventually grew bored and wandered off, their laughter fading into the distance. When Emily finished her routine, the remaining crowd erupted into applause. A few more bills landed in her hat, and someone even handed her a bottle of water. "Don't listen to them," an older man said, his voice firm. "You've got something special. Don't let anyone take that from you." Emily nodded, her throat tight with emotion. As the day turned into evening, Emily packed up her things, feeling a mix of exhaustion and relief. It hadn't been an easy day, but she had made it through. And in the end, that was enough. She walked home under the glow of streetlights, the city alive with its usual nighttime buzz. Her hat was heavier than it had been in weeks, the tips a welcome surprise. For the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to smile. Maybe things weren't perfect, but she still had her rhythm, her passion. And as long as she had that, she could keep going. The late afternoon sun bathed the street in golden light as Emily moved to the music, her every step fluid and deliberate. A small crowd had gathered again, watching in quiet admiration. A couple of children clapped their hands in rhythm with her movements, and for a brief moment, Emily felt at peace. Then she heard the deep, guttural rumble of engines in the distance. It started as a low hum, blending almost seamlessly with the city's ambient noise. But as the sound grew louder, more distinct, Emily's chest tightened. The familiar harmony of her portable speaker suddenly felt fragile against the growing roar. The bikers arrived like a thunderstorm, their heavy motorcycles cutting through the street with unapologetic force. Leather jackets adorned with patches and emblems glinted in the sun, and their laughter rolled out as loud and unrestrained as their engines. They stopped just a few feet from where Emily performed, parking their bikes in an intimidating semicircle around her. The small crowd that had been watching began to shift uneasily, sensing trouble. Emily hesitated, her movements faltering for just a second before she pushed herself to keep dancing. She wasn't about to let them rattle her. Not here. Not now. Hey, dancer girl, one of them called out, his voice loud and mocking. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scruffy beard and a cocky grin. He leaned back against his bike, arms crossed, radiating an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. "What's the big dream here?" he continued, gesturing dramatically toward her. "Gonna pirouette your way to fame?" The others erupted into laughter, their voices mingling with the low growl of their still-running engines. Emily said nothing, her face calm, her focus entirely on her movements. But inside, her frustration burned. She had dealt with hecklers before: drunk tourists, impatient shoppers, teenagers with nothing better to do, but something about this group felt different. There was a calculated cruelty to their tone, a deliberate effort to belittle her in front of everyone. "Come on, give us a real show," another biker taunted. He was younger, his face sharp and angular, his hair slicked back under a bandana. He mimicked her moves poorly, flailing his arms and stumbling in an exaggerated manner, earning more laughs from his friends. Emily's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. She kept dancing, her movements deliberate and precise, refusing to engage. But they weren't done. "Bet you can't even keep up with a simple beat," the younger biker sneered, his tone dripping with disdain. He strode forward and, with a swift kick, sent her hat of earnings flying. Coins scattered across the pavement, clinking and rolling in every direction. A few bills fluttered away, caught by the breeze. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, their discomfort palpable. Some murmured apologies as they left, while others avoided her gaze entirely. In the blink of an eye, Emily was alone, left to face her tormentors. For a moment, Emily stood frozen, her mind racing. The humiliation stung like an open wound, but it was the loss of her earnings that made her chest tighten. That money wasn't just spare change, it was her lifeline. The lead biker, the one who had started the taunts, smirked at her. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Emily straightened, her expression resolute. She bent down slowly, gathering the scattered coins and bills, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Her hands shook slightly, but she ignored it, focusing instead on the rhythm of her breath. The bikers watched her, their laughter subsiding as curiosity took hold. They hadn't expected her to respond like this, not with silence, not with calm. As Emily stood, her eyes met the leader's. There was no fear in her gaze, only a quiet determination that made his smirk falter for just a second. "You done?" she asked, her voice steady. The group exchanged glances, momentarily caught off guard by her composure. "Done? Sweetheart, we're just getting started," the leader said, recovering quickly. He stepped closer, towering over her, but Emily didn't back down. "I don't care what you think of me," she said, her voice unwavering. "But you don't get to take this from me." Her words hung in the air, heavier than any of them had anticipated. Unbeknownst to Emily, some of the crowd had lingered nearby, watching the confrontation unfold from a safe distance. Among them was a young man in a tailored suit, his sharp eyes fixed on her. He had been passing by earlier when her dancing caught his attention, and now he couldn't look away. Another onlooker, an older woman with kind eyes, stepped forward hesitantly. "That's enough," she called out, her voice shaking slightly but firm. The bikers turned toward her, their faces a mix of surprise and irritation. "Mind your business, lady," one of them snapped. But the interruption had done its job. The tension broke just enough for Emily to seize the moment. She picked up her speaker, tucked it under her arm, and stepped back, her movements careful but confident. She wasn't going to let them have the last word, not with the little audience that remained. Without saying anything more, she pressed play on her speaker. The music started again, soft at first, then building into a powerful crescendo. Emily began to dance. This time, her movements weren't just graceful, they were fierce, almost defiant. Her spins were sharper, her steps bolder. Every motion seemed to tell a story of resilience, of standing tall in the face of ridicule. The crowd began to reassemble, drawn back by the sheer force of her performance. Whispers of admiration spread among them. "She's incredible," someone murmured. The bikers, meanwhile, stood awkwardly on the sidelines. Their mocking grins had faded, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like unease. Emily finished her routine with a powerful leap, landing gracefully as the music swelled to its final note. She held her pose, her chest heaving as she caught her breath. The crowd erupted into applause, louder and more enthusiastic than any she had heard in weeks. A few people stepped forward, dropping money into her hat, a silent show of support. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado now noticeably absent. "Come on," the leader muttered, gesturing for his crew to follow. "Let's get out of here." One by one, they climbed onto their bikes, the roar of their engines masking their retreat. Emily watched them go, her expression unreadable. When the street finally grew quiet again, she looked down at her hat. It was fuller than it had been all day, the scattered coins and new contributions creating a small but meaningful pile. She smiled faintly, her fingers brushing over the money. As the crowd began to disperse, several people approached Emily to offer words of encouragement. "Don't let them get to you," the older woman said, her voice warm. "You're talented, dear. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The man in the suit nodded in agreement. "You've got something special. Keep at it." Emily thanked them, her chest swelling with gratitude. Their kindness reminded her that for every person who tried to tear her down, there were others willing to lift her up. As she packed up her things and prepared to leave, she felt a newfound sense of determination. They had tried to break her spirit, but they had only made her stronger. Emily remained in her spot long after the bikers roared away. The adrenaline that had fueled her defiance began to ebb, replaced by a quiet exhaustion. She bent down to gather the last of her scattered coins, the echo of their mocking voices still lingering in her mind. The world around her had returned to its usual rhythm. Cars passed by, indifferent. People walked briskly, heads down, as if nothing had happened. The crowd that had cheered her on just moments ago had thinned, leaving behind only faint whispers of their applause. But Emily wasn't one to dwell. She folded her hat, slid it into her bag, and wiped her speaker carefully as if the act could somehow cleanse the memory of what had just transpired. "Emily," a voice called, soft yet insistent. She turned to see the older woman who had spoken up earlier. The woman's kind eyes met hers, filled with concern. "That was brave of you," the woman said, stepping closer. "Not everyone would have stood their ground like that." Emily offered a faint smile. "I didn't feel brave. Just tired of people like them thinking they can do whatever they want." The woman nodded knowingly. "Well, you showed them. And more importantly, you reminded everyone watching that strength doesn't always roar." The words struck a chord with Emily, settling into her heart like a warm ember. She thanked the woman quietly before turning back to pack her things. Later that evening, Emily sat cross-legged in her tiny apartment. The space was modest, a single room with a small kitchen in the corner, walls adorned with faded posters of dancers she admired. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The day's events played on a loop in her mind. She could still see the bikers' mocking faces, hear the contempt in their laughter. But she also remembered the applause, the encouraging words from strangers. Emily reached for her notebook, a weather journal where she wrote down her thoughts, choreographed new routines, and scribbled bits of inspiration. People will always underestimate you, she wrote. But their opinions don't define your worth. What matters is how you choose to respond. She underlined the words twice before leaning back, her eyes drifting to the ceiling. For years, Emily had felt like an underdog. A former national dance champion, she had once stood on the grandest stages, her talent celebrated by thousands. But a series of personal setbacks had forced her to step away from the spotlight. Performing on the streets wasn't her dream, it was a necessity, a way to keep her passion alive while she worked towards something bigger. She didn't share that part of her story with anyone, not even the kind strangers who stopped to watch her. The next morning, Emily returned to her usual spot, her portable speaker in hand. Despite the prior day's confrontation, she refused to let fear keep her away. As she sat up, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The tinted window rolled down, revealing the man in the suit who had watched her the day before. "Good morning," he greeted, stepping out of the car. He looked even more polished in the daylight, his crisp white shirt and tailored jacket standing in stark contrast to the grit of the street. Emily hesitated, unsure of his intentions. "I hope I'm not intruding," he continued, holding up a business card. "My name's Daniel Harper. I'm a talent scout." She blinked, caught off guard. "A talent scout?" He nodded. "I was passing by yesterday when I saw your performance. You have a rare gift, Emily. The kind of talent that deserves a much bigger stage." Emily stared at him, her thoughts racing. She wanted to believe him, but years of rejection and disappointment had made her cautious. "I'm not looking for charity," she said carefully. Daniel smiled. "This isn't charity. It's an opportunity. I represent several performance venues in the city, and I'd like to invite you to audition for one of them." He handed her the card, which she accepted reluctantly. "Think about it," he said. "The offer stands, no pressure. Just know that people like you don't come around often." With that, he returned to his car and drove away, leaving Emily standing there, the card in her hand. That evening, Emily sat at her tiny kitchen table, the business card resting in front of her. The words "Daniel Harper, Artistic Director" gleamed in embossed gold letters. She couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and doubt.